Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming in. I see the number of participants is slowly stagnating, so I think this might be a good time to get started. Welcome everybody to a new session of eoPERCS. This week we have Ryan Mohammed, who will be presenting on the biogeography of breas, contextualizing the taphonomy, ecology, and diversity of Trinidad's asphaltic fossil record. Ryan is joining us from Trinidad and Tobago, and we can go ahead and get started. Before we actually get started with Ryan's talk, there are a few announcements that we would like to make. The talk is going to be for around 30 minutes. It's going to be followed by a moderated question and answers. This week we have Chrissy, who is in charge of taking in all the questions, and if there are any technical issues during the talk, Chrissy is a person to get in touch with via chat. After the talk, there will be a tea time with the speaker. Ryan will be staying on, and if people would like to stay on after the talk and have an informal discussion, please feel free to do so, and we encourage everyone to do so. And as always, don't forget to send your questions via chat to the Questions eoPERCS post. A few eoPERCS housekeepings. eoPERCS values the participation of all folks interested in the paleosciences. Please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar. The code of conduct is can be easily accessed through our website if you haven't already done so. Please mute yourself for the duration of the talk. It helps with noise, and it helps the speaker keep focus as well. And you can ask questions by chatting to the Questions eoPERCS host or by using the raise hand function that's available via Zoom as well. We now have closed captions built into Zoom. Use the CC button to show or hide them. And if you have any outstanding ECR, who's your colleague, or if you know of any ECR, we recommend that you go ahead and nominate them. The link for that will be dropped in the chat box. Another link that will be dropped is the weekly feedback form for demographic info. It's completely anonymous, optional, but highly encouraged. And you can also find that in the chat window. And now a little bit about the speaker himself. Ryan did his undergraduate at the University of West Indies in zoology and botany, followed by a master's in environmental microbiology. And Ryan recently got his PhD in aquatic ecology from the University of West Indies in 2019. He has published numerous papers and done additional training at La Brea Pit in Los Angeles and the National Museum of Heritage in New Delhi. Okay, and with that, I will let Ryan go ahead and share his screen, and we look forward to his talk.
Okay, thank you all for inviting me to today's session. It's indeed an honor to be able to represent the Caribbean. It's a huge torch to bear right now, but to represent the Caribbean and talking about our fossil records and our paleontological work, particularly in Trinidad, which has been greatly understudied. All right, so today I'll be talking about the biogeography of breas, and contextualizing taphonomy, ecology, and relating that to Trinidad's diversity, especially as it links to Trinidad's asphaltic record. So breas here, we use very precisely, but yet loosely, because breas is Spanish for tar, all right? Several of the tar pits around the world carry that name breas, and it literally means the tar. Okay, so you hear of several tar pits in LA, in South America, in Trinidad, in Cuba, and it's called the breas or La Breas, means the tar. And coincidentally, they also name these places La Brea, which means the tar, tapit. So as you translate it, it becomes the tapit in English. Okay. So we've decided to go along with this name, and there is an informal organization we've formed, or I should say a network that we formed using this breas theme. And I'll touch on that as I conclude. So Trinidad's work in fossils and Trinidad's work in with petroleum exploration. Those of you that don't know of the infamous Pitch Lake in Trinidad, it was rediscovered by Sir Walter Raleigh in the 1500s. But then in the 1800s, the British did a geological survey of Trinidad with reference to the Pitch Lake. 1865, there was an oil company formed, and we had the first dry holes being dug in the 1800s as well. But by the early 1920s, that was when we had several oil companies, and these would be some of the first oil companies on the planet. Because Trinidad was going basically hand in hand with oil exploration as in the US, and this was financed by the British, etc. All right, so in the early 1920s, that was when we had several oil companies being developed in Trinidad. This is very important because this directly links to our paleontological work. So the history of oil exploration, it really focused around the south part of Trinidad. Trinidad is located just slightly on the north coast of South America, right off of Venezuela, but it's at the base of the Caribbean archipelago. Now, again, in the 1920s, during this oil exploration, the first oil exploration indicated they found fossilized coleopteras, beetles. They found bits of rodent fragments. But then they started to get a little bit more interesting. They started to find larger things, come from a tooth, all right? They found Eremetriums, femurs in this general area during the exploration. Also, the mud volcanoes in the same general area of South Trinidad, they said there was one episode where a Gomphomer Eremetrium astragalus was spat out of a mud volcano. Obviously, we cannot verify if it actually got spat out of a mud volcano or if it was just happened to be around when the mud volcano, but the report indicated it came out of this mud volcano. And then we also had very exciting things happen where in the 1950s, an entire exoskeleton of a glyptodon was unearthed in this South Trinidad region. And it went to Milwaukee, and we believe it's still at the Milwaukee Museum. This is one of the many fossils that have left Trinidad, and we are in the process of trying to get more information about the fossils because not much records apart from what we have here. This photograph of a very old document is indicated. The photo on the top left is the actual glyptodon skeleton that is at the museum right now. Okay. Now, the reason I like to focus on the glyptodon is because glyptodons really show that link between Trinidad and Tobago. I am in Trinidad right now, but the country I'm in is Trinidad and Tobago. Tobago's an island off of the northeast part of Trinidad. Trinidad's northern range forms part of that northern Andean mountain range from South America, and Tobago is a direct extension of that as well. They have found glyptodon fossils in caves in Tobago. So it means that the presence of glyptodons shows that there was a direct land bridge from linking Trinidad to Tobago, but also Trinidad to Tobago to South America. And again, I'll point this out in these subsequent maps. 1950s, Elizabeth Wing out of Florida discovered more glyptodon remains, slot remains, birds and small mammals. And again, a lot of this it was housed at the University of Florida, and it's still housed at the University of Florida. But now we jump forward a few decades. And in 2018, at this Latin America conference, which was hosted by University of West Indies, the Biodiversity MSc program, I had the good fortune meeting these two young ladies, Dr. on what would be on my left, holding the bear, and Ashlyn Farrell having soup. And they were from the La Brea Tapetan Museum, and they were telling me about these fossils, and I have no idea what they were speaking about. I was just starting at the University of the West Indies Zoology Museum, so I was intrigued, but I knew nothing at all about fossils at this point. But they put things in place, and we continued the discussions, and a year later, we had the first batch of Trinidadian fossils repatriated thanks to the efforts of the La Brea Tapet Museum. They were repatriated back to Trinidad in 2019. But this is where I need to tell you all a little bit about me and how this really, it was serendipitous of how this actual event transpired. My background is in aquatic ecology, where I have a passion for working with fish, also mud volcanoes, but also ecology. I worked on armored catfish, on microbiology of catfish, especially catfish in the ornamental trade. It took me to various habitats all across Trinidad and Tobago, from agricultural lands to nice forests. But then we also had in bottom corner here, the Trinidad and Tobago, the Trinidad Pitch Lake and mud volcanoes and sulfur springs in the forest, where I was looking at parasites and how they evolved coping mechanisms to exist on fish in these very extreme habitats. Now, this is not a fossil of a fish. This is a prehistoric looking fish. It's not a prehistoric fish. It's an armored catfish that obviously a dead one that was found on the edge of the water at a mud volcano. This mud volcano in particular looks like a lake with mud bubbling at the center. And this was a carcass that I found at the edge of it. You can see it's a very interesting habitat. It is a little bit more viscous than quicksand, but sometimes it could be very liquidy. Some of the mud volcanoes form proper cones instead of just lakes. Some of them form fields with several cones. Some of them form actual pits. And Trinidad is a very diverse culture where the Hindu population, they have now incorporated these mud volcanoes, some of these mud volcanoes, into their rituals. Some of them form almost like give a landslide type structures flowing directly into the sea. So we could see that mud volcanoes are very, very diverse themselves in their structure and the way they present themselves geologically and ecologically. But if you notice here, there's an animal trapped in the mud. And at first, that was not too important to me. It wasn't a fish, so I wasn't too interested. But I started to realize more and more there was aquatic hope in these very interesting habitats, extreme habitats. Eventually, I started to have appreciation for that association between mud volcanoes and oil, the tappets. Some mud volcanoes would exude oil. Some oil seeps exuded mud. All of them had some association with brackish water ecology. So you'd be in the middle of the forest and be getting brackish water type plants. So it meant that there was something very interesting occurring with the ecology of this area that could facilitate tar, hydrocarbons, brackish water conditions, yet in the middle of a tropical rainforest. So I think this was what Alexis and Ashling used to hook my attention into paleontology. They used that my love, my passion for aquatic ecology, and brought in that element of doubt and that element of questioning why these things occurred with this particular habitat. And then we bring it all back to the pitch lake. The picture on the left looks like if it's a large swamp. On the right, a few weeks later, it looks like a car park with a few puddles. Same habitat. But it shows how diverse this habitat and how extreme this habitat could be and how dynamic this habitat could be. And yet we have organisms able to survive in this very extreme habitat. But not only do we have organisms that could survive right now, we have organisms that used to roam Trinidad and were trapped in these habitats. And this is where we bring it back to the fossils, where these young ladies really drew my attention. The fossils came to Trinidad. And to my surprise, none of the fossils were actually found in the pitch lake. They were found at different oil exploration sites from the 1920s, 1950s, etc. So with this, I did a small stint at the La Brea Tapit Museum, where I learned more about their fossil records. And it showed, they had a great diversity as well, but their diversity focused on a lot of large organisms. And they had several microfossils. Microfossils wasn't something I ever thought about, but lodged in sediment. And again, this would have been our beetles or jaws of lizards, tiny lizards, even small tooth fragments from the prehistoric dogs. And the La Brea Tapita Museum, they have a large exhibit of dire wolves, as well as some of the smilodons, etc. But we see here, their museum, their collection housed a lot of predators, okay? And with that, we wanted to see, okay, if their Tapita Museum has very similar ecological landscapes, how does that compare to the biodiversity that we were finding in Trinidad based on our records? They also had in La Brea Tapita Museum some of the prehistoric horses, our proboscians, mammoths, also were highlighted there. And we started again get some of the smaller mammals out of LA. And going back to my roots in botany, they also had a wide diversity of plant remains. And this would be some examples. So the nice thing about Tapit fossil work, Tapit paleontology, is that it gives you not a snapshot of one organism that is lodged in sediment and fossilized, and the actual bone fragments are replaced by minerals, but instead you get a better idea of the ecology of a region because several organisms get trapped in this tar. So you have a good example, a good idea of what the diversity of an entire region could be around that time period. They even found elements of fossilized insect larvae. Because the fossilization process is slightly different in tar, you don't get complete removal of the bone tissue and the collagen, etc., by the geological rock, minerals, etc., but you get preservation of bone, which means DNA out of Tapit fossils. So this tells us a lot about the sociality of organisms that existed in this habitat in LA. We wanted to see if we could get the same type of information out of the database from Trinidad, the database we are starting to create by tracking down all of these fossils that have been reported. So LA's museum, their history again wasn't during oil exploration. During the same 1900s, Trinidad exploration was going on. And we see that the asphalt preservation occurred for fossils in two ways. You could have primary entrapment, where organisms died in the asphalt, they were trapped, died in the asphalt, and they were immediately preserved after death. Or you could have secondary infiltration, where the organism died in place, or died and were transported by water. And then the asphalt came in later, like an oil seep, and preserved them. So you could have two different mechanisms of allowing the organisms to be trapped in the asphalt. Now, in the first scenario, you would get big mammals, and you see a bias in carnivores, because if you have a carcass trapped in tar, that carcass isn't going anywhere, or you have a struggling animal trapped in tar, giving out panic calls, etc., and stress calls. Predators would come. It's easy food for it's easy prey, but then they too would get trapped, and then when they cry out, other predators would come, and a vicious cycle occurs where now you have a very predator heavy scenario. So this is one of the explanations why at LA their fossil record shows a heavy predator presence. Basic ecology and basic biology will tell you that in an ecosystem, you usually have a pyramidal trophic layout, where you have a lot of primary producers, a lot of herbivores, then some omnivores, and then as you go up this pyramid, you have less and less organisms moving upwards, and it's usually your more carnivorous and your predator-heavy organisms would be at the top of the pyramid, but you would have less of them. Their biomass might be bigger, but you'd have less of them. It's the exact opposite in the La Brea Tapit collection, where they have a lot of predators being present. So this is where they now have to go the direction of looking into microfossils to get an idea of what other organisms might be there. So, and you'll also get your vultures, etc., that would come to prey on these carrion. So one of the good features of also working with fossils that one, you have morphological preservation. It could be dark in color, so you get a bit of contrast. It's easier to extract, and it's not articulated. Okay, but at the same time, even though it's not articulated, you do get better structure of the organisms present. But instead of getting an entire skeleton or the entire remains of one organism, what you end up getting sometimes is a jigsaw puzzle, a 3D jigsaw puzzle with multiple puzzles mixed in. So in other words, you might get from one asphaltic block, you would get several organisms mixed in. Then the entire jigsaw puzzle is not assembled. There's multiple organisms all mixed into one. So it's an interesting game of putting these 3D puzzles back together, hoping you not just have the right parts going in the right place, but the right organisms linking to each other. With secondary infiltration, in this scenario, you get something died in the water and the asphalt came up and preserved. In this scenario, you would expect to get some articulation because, again, the organism in this scenario would be intact, and the asphalt preserves it as is in situ. In this we get things like millipedes, turtles, sometimes even get vegetation. So now we want to have an idea of how does this relate to Trinidad. We have several tappets all around the planet. The two in particular that I've mentioned would be the one in LA, yeah. And then we also do want to talk about the one in Trinidad. This map in particular is very, very important, as I'll elaborate. Sorry. Yeah. Now, because the tappets are found around the planet, our next question was, how does this relate to the extinction of various species? If you look at the megafauna lost by continent in North Eurasia, 36% of the larger mammalian population, including some of the primitive Homo sapiens, were lost. Okay, in Africa, even more, 16% only survived. But in South America, you had 83% loss. North Eurasia, you have 36% loss. In Africa, only 16% loss. That is why in the African continent now we still have a lot of large mammals. But in South America, 83% loss. Now, how does this relate to Trinidad? And what we found was that because Trinidad is very closely associated to Venezuela in terms of its geology, proximity, etc., the expectation was that Trinidad's fossil records or paleontological biodiversity should be very similar to Venezuela. This is Ascanio Rincon, one of the paleontologists out of Venezuela we work with, and this was one of his dig sites. As you can see, where he is working, it's very different from the substrate outer La Brea tappet in LA, and very different from what we are seeing in Pitch Lake and the Marac forest in Trinidad. So even though at different tappets, different asphaltic fossils, you would expect similar substrate, it's really quite different. I mentioned earlier that Trinidad has a close association with the South American mainland and where Tobago is oriented in relation to Trinidad. From this map, if you notice, Trinidad, this outline here, is closer to South America than Tobago is to Trinidad. During the early Ice Age, this entire region here was one landmass. But as the ice subsided, etc., then we started to have a loss of the land bridge here, Trinidad was separated from South America between 10 and 20,000 years ago, which is around the same age as some of the fossils we are finding now. The separation between Tobago and Trinidad occurred a little bit earlier. All right, so it means that one, we would get some similar organisms occurring in Tobago as Trinidad. Tobago has a very Antillean type fauna because it was separated from Trinidad earlier. So you had colonization of some of the other organisms occurring in Tobago around the same time the rest of the Caribbean islands, which are a lot of these would be volcanic islands, they would now be informed as well. So you had colonization occurring. But Trinidad maintained that South American link for a greater period of time. And from that picture I showed it as Ascanio before, you saw that was more or less like almost a savanna type habitat. This is not Venezuela, this is the Arepo savanna in Trinidad. It is one of our last remaining natural savannas in Trinidad. And it means that a lot of this Ice Age fauna that have been described so far would have been roaming habitat very similar to the Arepo savanna in Trinidad. this is one of our scientific reserves because it's one of the last places that has this natural type habitat. It's untouched. And from an ecological standpoint and from a climate change perspective, here would be an ideal place to investigate things like climate change, because we know the habitat here and the conditions here hasn't changed much. In fact, the rest of the island, that has changed, but here it remained constant. So this is a living, breathing time capsule with some small palm forest. But again, you see, no big tropical rainforest. It's palm forest, palm islands, etc. And this would have been the type of habitat our large mammals that once roamed Trinidad would have encountered. When we did the comparison, we saw that Trinidad, surprisingly, our species assemblage, it closely resembled the Ecuador, some of the Ecuador sites, rather than the Venezuela sites. The Venezuela sites had a lot of biodiversity. Unlike what the California sites presented, and California sites are different from the rest of the Caribbean, where the California sites focused on a lot of predators. It is a predator-heavy scenario where the other organisms, again, they were trapped there and the predators came in and feasted on them. It's apparently in the rest of the Caribbean and South America, it was a different scenario presenting itself, where organisms died and the asphalt would have come in secondarily and preserved. So whilst in LA, you would have an actual tar pit trap, in the rest of the Caribbean and South America, a different scenario played out. And we see that Trinidad's assemblage is very similar to Ecuador and to some extent even Venezuela. But so far, we have only looked at a subset of all the fossils that came to Trinidad, in the sense that all the fossil records we have for Trinidad would have been stuff that was sent to either Milwaukee, it was sent to Smithsonian, it was sent to Florida University, etc. This would have been stuff that was excavated. Some of it was scientifically done, looking at the stratosphere. Example, the wing excavation, Elizabeth Wing's excavation in 1959. Some of it were not done scientifically because it was done during the oil exploration, where they're drilling or they're doing site preparation, they hit a bone and it's like, what is this? And they toss it out and it's like, wait, this is not a rock, this is a femur. So it wasn't done scientifically, but it's in these fossil records. What it means is that there's still a lot of work to be done in Trinidad for us to really have a better idea of our ice age biodiversity in this tropical island. And thus far, my colleagues and I, along with Alexis, we've published this paper in, I think this came out in 2020, early 2020, where we looked at all the fossil records for Trinidad thus far, collated it, and were able to have this map produced indicating that Trinidad has a very strong similarity to Ecuador. As I come to a close, I would like to acknowledge you have seen La Brea Tar Pit Museum on several of the slides and the National Trust. Because the fossils have now been repatriated to Trinidad, they would form part, they're housed at the University of West Indies Zoology Museum. They become custodians of it, and that's why they acknowledge. But we have now taken the decision to have all of these fossils listed as heritage items for Trinidad and Tobago. This work would have not been possible without the assistance of National Geographic as well. Okay, and in closing, I bring us back to my original slide on breas, where we form this network now where we use breas as the acronym for Bridging Research and Education at Asphaltic Sites around the planet. And different breas sites, so to say, has different mascots. I believe the one in LA the one in LA would have been the Smilodon or the saber-tooth tiger, I believe. We think a good mascot for Trinidad and Tobago breas would be the glyptogon, because that's the one fossil that has been found in both Trinidad and Tobago. Even though Tobago has no asphaltic sites, we know this animal existed in our joint island. So I bring talk to a close now, and I'd like to open the floor for questions. I'll pass it back on to Natasha.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. That was a wonderful talk. Definitely learned a lot of new things and a lot of exciting things. We have a few questions coming through. And again, if people have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, send them to the questions at eoPERCS. And the first question that's come through is, I'm also dropping it in the chat. What else, where else would you likely expect to see tar pits? And by solely examining the tar pits, can you expect to see more of the primary versus secondary preserved fossils?
Okay, so there's been a recent discovery of a tar pit in Oklahoma. So basically, anywhere you expect to find oil, you might find a tar pit. Now we even seen that association between mud volcanoes and tar pits. In some of the Pacific Islands, they have mud volcanoes, but they're not associated with oil. So, we're really not sure. In Trinidad, the major tar pit is the pitch, but then we find that in the middle of the forest, there is the Marak oil seeps. So there are a lot of different sites in Trinidad where we find new tar pits and oil seeps. What we think is that we would get both secondary and primary entrapment occurring. I'm not sure of in the rest of the world. In Trinidad, when we visited some of the active tar seeps now, we do get remains of things like millipedes, snails, insects. We haven't found any mammalian type remains, recent mammalian remains in any of these seeps. Maybe these animals, they start to realize, maybe I shouldn't walk on the black soil after thousands of years of evolution. But we're not getting any major mammals now. Maybe these mammals, they no longer exist. So body mass wise, they can evade sinking because they're just lighter. We see lizards able to skim across the surface of water based on surface tension. So maybe all of these things at play, it's not just one scenario we need to look at. So I think the pitch lake, even though Alexis, she disagrees with me that the pitch lake is not a very good place to do excavations, and I could understand why. Pitch is really, really hard. It's harder than soil or rock to excavate. You need proper industrial tools to excavate there to look for fossils. So it makes sense that there's minor. But if you use any of the tour guides at the pitch lake, they show you fragments of bone that came up from the pitch, and it means stuff used to get trapped there. And if it used to get trapped there, probably still there until the pitch lake decided to spit it out. So it would be a combination of primary and secondary entrapment. And this would just show how high the biodiversity of the region was and still is.
Yeah. Great, thank you for the answer. We have another question that I'm also dropping in the chat. What a fascinating topic and talk. I was wondering if you could comment on whether there is anything about the tar seeps or environment in Trinidad and Ecuador which would have favored secondary preservation in tar as compared to the California type examples. And I think you kind of touch on this with the answer that you just gave.
Yeah, well, I don't know much about the Ecuador system. But what I do know, having visited the La Brea tar pit site, I could see how organisms would get trapped. that, that exudes a very liquid, sticky oil. The one in Trinidad is very different. It's very grainy. So I could see organisms dying there, and then the it's almost like has a thick lava-like appearance. If you look at the pitch lake, it looks like pancake batter. They're just kind of folding over on each other. So I could see things getting buried there, but it's so slow moving, you could evade it. But if you're already dead, well, you're kind of stuck with it. So that's probably why in Trinidad we have more a secondary type preservation happening. At one of the new sites we want to excavate, it is a bit of a floodplain near a river, and it is on the slope of that is an oil seep. So we might get both secondary and primary fossil entrapment happening in that at that site. And I'm really excited about this site because it's very closely associated to a river system and a floodplain. I get to finally find an aquatic fossil, hopefully. I haven't found a fossilized fish or a fossilized turtle or anything like that. It's all been mammals. So hopefully I might get something aquatic for me to get excited.
Cool, yeah, maybe it's this one. So we have another question, moving away from tar pits and a little bit about the assemblages. Why do you think the assemblage in Trinidad matches the Ecuador assemblage better than the Venezuela assemblage? Do you think that might change as you continue studying and identifying the fossils from Trinidad?
Yeah, definitely. I think at Trinidad right now, what we know of fossils in Trinidad was based out of oil exploration. It has not been a proper scientific, okay, with the exception of what Elizabeth Wing did. So they for oil exploration, it wasn't even that they were drilling into the ground. This was site preparation. They went down 1 to 2 meters. So they haven't actually dug for the purposes of looking at fossils. This was stuff that they just assumed was landfillage. And, it was just in the spoils of land preparation. So, and this would have been only where the oil wells were being constructed. So in that entire region, it means there's a lot of fossils remaining there, we suspect, because the only thing that happened since then is the forest grew back. So there's a lot of new work to be done in Trinidad.
Yep. And then that actually kind of leads us to the next question, which is, what do you see as the next steps for this work? Like, where would you go first? And then, yeah. So,
and I like this question because the question is what happens next? What happens next is one, funding. You need to get funding. Okay. What happens after funding is we need to actually do another excavation. What is happening simultaneously with funding is protecting the site as well as protecting the fossils we already have. Because these fossils were able to leave Trinidad with permission, because then there was no regulatory system in place. How these fossils, they leave, when they come back, who knows, right? So now we through the National Trust, we decided, okay, you know what? These fossils are part of our heritage, so we need to protect them. And in this process, we also try to get funding. There was as recent as last week, Trinidad and Tobago celebrated our Independence Day. And to commemorate this, we had a fossil workshop with the National Trust where we announced the fossils were being listed as heritage items of Trinidad and Tobago. And in this process, we want to, at that workshop, we are trying to build capacity with our local secondary schools, with our local university, to get more people willing to volunteer. But I mean, at an excavation site, as you all know, you just don't come and dig. We need to teach people how to dig, how to do it systematically. So we had this workshop to start to build that capacity. So when borders are open and we are allowed to go back into the forest in this post-COVID world, we won't be starting from scratch. People would be aware of the health and safety associated with doing a proper excavation, with the proper systematics associated with doing an excavation. So we build capacity with the locals in Trinidad, with the collaboration of the La Brea Tapetan Museum. We now are also in discussions with some people from Florida University that manages the wing collection. So we foster links with the experts around the planet to help us build our own capacity so we could do further excavations. So that's where the next steps would go.
Yeah, so a lot of exciting possibilities in the near future.
We need an actual paleontologist in Trinidad. You can't have an aquatic biologist pretending to be a paleontologist. So my aim is to get someone skilled in paleontology in Trinidad here eventually.
This is the perfect platform to host such a talk and discussion then. Yeah,
yes.
Great. So if there are no other questions, we can move to the next part of the presentation or the discussion series. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Please fill out the weekly feedback form. The link will be in the chat so that we can learn a bit more about who attended today's seminar. September 14th, next week, we have a little change in the schedule and the presenter is to be announced. You should hear from the newsletter that we sent everyone who is signed up. What's up next is tea time with today's speaker. Learn more about Ryan, engage if there are paleontologists who would also like to stay back and have a further discussion on what Ryan talked about. It's a great place to meet new friends or bump into old ones. And what we're going to do is have a 2-minute water break. So get up, walk around, have a drink of water, and then come back in 2 minutes. And I'm starting the timer now.